Yeah, they're on the 11-yard line.
You're not-
Left.
I'm not sanitizer here.
Another interception,
Excuse me.
another in the end zone.
Really? Oh,
Yeah,
Ravens threw your interception?
yep,
Oh,
second,
all right.
17-7 when I checked like
Yeah.
20 minutes ago.
yeah, it still is, last I looked.
That's good.
All right.
The Browns and the Steelers fans agree on anything.
I will wait a few minutes. Well, let me point out to you that if you weren't here with us the first year, which was how many years ago? 3, maybe 4 years ago? You can catch up with that much of it on discovering his story at yctv.org. yctv.org. I noticed, I was watching a day or two ago that we are in Assyria, or looking at the civilization of Assyria and the impact that Assyria had on Israel and Judah and some of the other nations around. I think there will be all told about 5 episodes just on Assyria because it has such a great impact on the entire region of the Middle East. And then I'm hoping next time I'm going to record to finish up Assyria and then go on to Babylon. And maybe things will pick up a little bit from there on. Well, tonight, it seems strange not to say welcome to medieval times, but tonight it's Renaissance times. And originally I thought, well, that'll take a week. But no, it's going to take longer than a week to cover the Renaissance. There's a lot to look at there, and the more I get into it, the more, of course, there is. All right, so let's ask God to bless our time together. Father, thank you for the opportunity we have to be together and to study history. We thank you as we look at history, we see your hand in all of it, that whether you're directing the events to bring about your plan, or whether in the case of what we'll be looking at for the next few weeks, the abilities that you've given people and how they can use it for your glory. And we can praise you for the talents that we can enjoy. And whatever the outcomes of what we are looking at tonight, Lord, I pray that you would use it and to help us appreciate you more, and that you would bring glory to yourself through our time together. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, the Renaissance. The Renaissance was a period of great change in Europe from the 14th to the 16th centuries, give or take. Anytime you're talking about a period of history, it's usually hard to nail down what exactly was the beginning and what exactly was the end. And so different historians will define the parameters a little differently. But generally speaking, we're talking about a 200-year period. I was mentioning to someone before we started that I think of the Renaissance as just being a time where it was an explosion of knowledge and ability, but it happened over a long period of time. So it wasn't like all this happened overnight. Renaissance, as I'm sure you remember from maybe junior high school world history or art class somewhere, it comes from a French word, or it is a French word for rebirth. Rebirth. The Western world was on the verge of a widespread revival of learning and artistic achievement. Why the word rebirth? Well, it's used to describe the time following the Middle Ages, which is where we are. It was a time of new thought and advancement, new ways of thinking, developed in the areas of art, architecture, science, philosophy, and politics, or again, these areas here, art, including painting and sculpture, architecture, literature, science. And it's interesting, and you'll probably understand why, that this Renaissance, this rebirth of knowledge, occurs in so many different areas. It wasn't just in art, for example. Let's consider the causes of the Renaissance. There were changes taking place in society. As you remember, the Black Death went through Europe in a couple different waves. With that, also there came waves of famine, starvation, warfare had been going on in Europe. All those catastrophic events, the enormous loss of life that took place may have led to the changes that we see in the 1300s. Certainly they had an effect upon it. And in a sense, Renaissance was needed. You can imagine the people going through the turmoil of the 12 and 1300s all that was going on, certainly would have expected that this was the end of the world, as up to 3/4 of the population of Europe died. Very huge changes taking place in the economies of these of Europe. How now is food going to be grown? How are different people in different areas, different languages going to relate to one another? And then what is the relationship to the church? So we see the decrease in population led to an increase in food production, as the monks have been developing different ways of producing food, innovations in agriculture for a number of years, and those methods came to be used to produce more food, which caused prices to come down in food. People had more money to spend because labor was at a premium, and so wages went up, at least for a time, until some governments put a freeze on wage increases, although prices for items still continued to go up. People began to specialize in making certain things. And when you have specialization, you also have increased income for people. The city-states began to grow. The manors were dying away. Feudalism was dying away as well. And so urban areas grew into existence, and they became specialized as well, especially in Italy. And these are all things that we've talked about over the last few months. We've seen how Italy was divided into several large city-states in the north, various kingdoms, the papal states in the south. The Catholic Church, nobles, merchants, and artisans dominated society in the city-states. Many sought to display their new wealth with knowledge of arts. And so those are some of the causes of the Renaissance, but we can go further than that. We can look at many of the things that had occurred in the previous century or so. So that the medieval world, religious, political, and social, was changing. The medieval world was based on the idea of unity. The individual was always a member of some social unity, and it was as a corporate member of society that he gained his importance. The unity of the Holy Roman Empire was the medieval ideal, but real unity was never realized. There was conflict almost continually within its borders, so that by the end of the Middle Ages, the emperor had little real authority outside Germany itself, and not always much within. As a result of this and many other factors, nationalism excuse me, began to take root. And we've looked at that as especially France and England began to become cohesive as national units. And then we saw last week how Spain came into existence, and other smaller areas became proud of who they were as a people. The three major groups of people organized themselves into nations that functioned during the Renaissance are, in fact, the three major nations that we have already examined, and that is England, France, and Spain. Following the 100 Years' War, England had fallen into a civil conflict known as the Wars of the Roses. This ended in 1485 with the Tudor family enthroned. Under this dynasty, there came to England greater internal unity and security and ever-increasing national consciousness, a feeling which was to culminate in the Renaissance England of Queen Elizabeth. The final defeat of England in the 100 Years' War brought to France freedom from foreign rule within its borders, allowing the kings of France to solidify their authority. France began to be conscious of herself as a nation, to be proud of her achievements, and took her place as one of the great nations of Europe. And then having driven out the Moors, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile established a united Christian nation on the Iberian Peninsula. A chance discovery by Columbus in 1492 led to immense wealth in gold and silver, so that during the 16th century, the new nation of Spain was able to expand her power to become the most dominant authority in Europe. The authority of the church had not yet been breached, but it was weakening because of its practices and questions about its authority. Immorality and abuse for financial gain by priests on up through the Pope himself created disdain and mistrust by the people. For example, as temporal ruler over the states of the church in central Italy, the Pope used monies collected as the spiritual ruler over the church throughout Europe to finance his own ambitions and to wage wars, sometimes wars against the very people from whom he had collected spiritual monies. When men began questioning the rightness of the temporal interests of the papacy, they soon began thinking of its teaching and asking for a return to a Christianity free from the tangles and intrigues of worldly affairs. Another change came in the language of the people. Latin had been the dominant language of church, state, and academia for many centuries. With the growth of the availability of Greek literature, scholars began to study Greek, reading works of literature as well as the New Testament in the original language rather than Latin translations. And oftentimes finding that the Latin translations were not accurate. With this study of Greek literature came a new way of thinking about human life. The questioning of old mores also brought about scientific inquisitiveness. Experiment and investigation brought a new knowledge of the heavens, knowledge which caused much heart searching and which was very disturbing to the conservative and orthodox thinkers as they began to challenge what had always been thought to be true in the scientific realm. With the weakening of the empire and the growth of nationalities, other forms of society tended to break up or change. The invention, well, so look at some of the innovations. I'll go on with this first. The invention of gunpowder had already made the feudal castle useless as a place of defense. And as the kings, especially in France, gained more power, feudalism was weakened until in its medieval form it almost disappeared. New methods of industry tended to weaken the guilds, which in too many cases had become exclusive and narrow and unwilling to compromise with new ideas. As a result, town life changed and industry expanded. There were a number of innovations that helped to contribute to these new ideas and this rebirth of learning. One of the most important, of course, was Johann Gutenberg and the invention of, well, we call it the invention of the printing press. There were printing presses before this. Anybody know the difference between what Gutenberg did and what was available before? Yeah, before they could print, but you had to carve out an entire page and print that, and that was very time consuming. And then you could only use it for that page. You couldn't change it. Gutenberg came up with a movable type printing press. We'll get a better picture later, but that's the printing press part of it. And here's how it worked. Block letters were held together by a wooden form. Ink was rolled over the raised surfaces and then pressed against a sheet of paper. And so these are individual letters. You may not be able to see it, but between each of these letters, you can see a line. So each of these are individual letters. So once you have printed a page, you can take out those letters and rearrange them to print something different. And so that added to the abilities of the printer and also made printing less expensive. So books could be printed. And anybody know the first book that Gutenberg printed on his printing press? It was the Bible in Latin. And so he was able to, print however many pages he wanted. Let's say a page 1 in the Bible. And then when you printed all the pages you're going to do that, you can rearrange the letters to page 2 and print that. And it's still rather time consuming, but still it's much better than the system that had been there previously, and greatly enhanced not only the ability to purchase books at a cheaper rate and therefore a dissemination of knowledge through books, but also the dissemination of knowledge through things like newspapers to spread the word of what people were saying, or pamphlets. It didn't have to be books. All kinds of printing took place. There were some other innovations as well. This is still talking about the printing press. Books could be produced quickly, less expensive. More people could afford to buy books, not only because they're less expensive, but people had more money. If you're involved in a trade, you can earn more money for yourself than was available previously through everybody being, a serf on a farm. And they began demanding books that were printed in the vernacular. Not everybody could read Latin so well. And so, you go down to the local bookseller and say, I want to buy a book, but do you have anything in a language I understand? And so there came to be a demand for books in the language of people, because people having gained more money, gaining more leisure time for themselves, they wanted to read, and so literacy rates went up. People began to learn how to read, and some of the things they were reading about, as many authors were putting their works out there, is something called humanism. There were a lot of things. I looked online to see innovations during the Renaissance, and one list I saw, I think there were like 131 things were invented, including, I think, a toilet was one of them. Eyeglasses was one. This relates to reading. I included that in here. Eyeglasses were invented to help nearsightedness, because if you're nearsighted, you need help to read. And that increased with the printing press. Another innovation that helped with the promotion of art, especially in the Renaissance, and there probably are, like I see, probably hundreds of different things we could look at, but these are some that I thought were the most important. First, the printing press, and then secondly, paints. Now, unfortunately, I found some pictures that illustrated what I wanted to say about this, but it turns out that I didn't copy the information. And so I'm not sure if I've got it right now, going by memory. Elizabeth, maybe you can help here. But originally, or up until this time, paint was, I think, tempera paint. Is that how you say it even? Tempera? Would that be correct as far as you know? Tempera paint. And then people figured out how to add egg to it, which gave it more, I don't know, solidity, would you say, or more
Viscosity.
Hmm.
Viscosity.
Yeah, maybe that's it. It was, wouldn't run, had more stability. And then I think it was Da Vinci even that came up with adding beeswax to paint. And all these innovations simply made it so that when a person was painting, he could do so with more accuracy and more detail than had been possible before. So they're coming up with all kinds of things that will enable them to do better at what they're doing. And this is happening in all areas. This is just a couple of examples. So we'll look at the contrast between what's happening in the Renaissance with the Middle Ages. Again, this is happening over several hundred years. So we have to keep that in mind. It's kind of like we're looking back on all the developments, but there came to be a real shift in the way people were thinking about the world and themselves. So the contrast with the Middle Ages. Those in the Renaissance viewed the medieval period as a dark parenthesis between the classical cultures of Greek and Rome and the modern age of the Renaissance. So that's why sometimes you'll hear it called the Dark Ages, although specifically the Dark Ages refers to the early part of the Middle Ages, but some refer to it as everything before the Renaissance. There came to be an arrogance that developed among those in the Renaissance period toward what had been occurring in the Middle Ages, toward intellectuals there, toward people in academia there, toward artists there, because they saw themselves as so much better than that. And there was also a desire or an impression that they had that the ancient cultures of Greek and Rome were better than the European culture of the Middle Ages. And in this Renaissance period, we need to recapture what was the best of man back in ancient Rome and Greece and leave behind what's been going on in Europe for 1,000 years or so. As these ancient cultures became more accessible, and of course they're more accessible because of things like the Crusades, which brought Greek literature to Europe, the defeat of Constantinople by the Muslims, which caused many Greek scholars to flee Constantinople, and they brought their books, their libraries with them, and those became available to people. So all these things contributed to an increased knowledge about these ancient cultures, and the cry was ad fontes, which means to the foundations. Let's get back to the foundations. And we can kind of identify that. We look back at the founding of our country and we say, let's get back to the foundations of what our country was based on. And they're saying something similar. Let's get back to the foundations of what our civilization is based on. Western civilization is based on the Greek and Roman periods. That's what gave us the foundation. And during the Middle Ages, we have moved away from that. And so there came about the attitude that ancient culture was much more advanced than medieval culture, that even the Latin compositions of those in ancient Rome was far superior to the Latin of the scholastics. Everything about ancient Rome, by the way, and when those things were stated, the scholastics were kind of offended. What do you mean the Latin of ancient Rome is better than my Latin? But it was true. Everything about ancient Rome and Greece was perceived to be far better than contemporary Europe. So there were great differences in the outlook of these two periods of time. So let's look at the list here. First of all, in the Renaissance, there was a zest for living. There was a freshness about the Renaissance period, about the attitudes that people had, so that it was almost like spring had come. The opposite of the Chronicles of Narnia, where it was always winter and never Christmas. It seemed like in the Middle Ages, it was always winter and never spring. In the thinking of people, in the lack of optimism, because in the Middle Ages, remember, there was not much change going on. Whatever you're born to, that's what you're with the rest of your life. If you're born as a serf, that's what you are. But things had begun to change in the 14th century in the 15th century, so that there was more mobility among people. Education had been increasing. All those things that we've been talking about for months led up to this perception that the way things have been were not very good. We need something fresh. The medieval perspective was a rather sober one. It was otherworldly. You know, we're not going to get much in this life, but this life is simply a preparation for the hereafter. That's when things will be better. That's when they'll be good. So they're concerned with the welfare of their souls and the work of the church, not with what was going on every day. Any comments about that contrast, the zest for living versus the sober, otherworldly perspective? You see how that would be the case? All right, next, the Renaissance gloried in the past. They look back at past history, especially ancient Rome and Greece, whereas the medieval perspective was fixing their thoughts on the future. Next, Renaissance people lived with enthusiasm in the present. They looked at the past, but that gave them an enthusiasm for the present, because the perspective in the past was a more positive perspective. It was a perspective of life. And it seemed that the medieval perspective was one of almost one of death. You know, the only escape from this drudgery of life that I'm in is death. And then, you know, maybe I'll go to heaven, or maybe I'll go to at least purgatory until somebody can pay enough money for me to get out. You know, so you can see what a negative feeling there must have been there. So the troubled present was of little interest. Why would I want to expend any energy in thinking about the present, or writing about the present, or anything? Because the present is a drudgery. The Renaissance emphasized reason. That's what they got from the ancient scholars, whereas the medieval perspective was emphasizing faith. Reason is not really a part of the equation for most people, as they're depending on the Roman Catholic Church to instruct them and to tell them about their faith. You believed it because the Roman Catholic Church said it, not because it was reasonable, not because it made any sense. You know, as we have looked at, you know, many months ago, we looked at the seven sacraments of the Roman Catholic Church, or as we've since looked at other doctrines that were proposed and taught from the Roman Catholic Church. Many of us sat and said, but that doesn't even make sense. That's not reasonable. Well, for the person in the Middle Ages, it didn't need to be reasonable. You know, to paraphrase a bumper sticker, the church said it, I believe it, that settles it. But the Renaissance period emphasized reason. It has to make sense. Next, it emphasized a questioning attitude. You know, and that usually goes along with reason. If you're thinking about things, you're asking questions. And so they questioned everything to arrive at truth. Whereas in the medieval period, because they are simply told to believe what they're told, authority was what was emphasized. You follow the authority. You do what you're told. Don't make any waves. Don't question anything. And then lastly, the Renaissance period emphasized free inquiry. You know, that goes along with the questioning attitude too. Asking questions about things, not being afraid to challenge what had always been thought or taught. Whereas the medieval period emphasized tradition. Why do we do these things? It's tradition. Even if, and especially if it's the tradition of the church, but even in other areas, you know, politics and economics, whatever, you do things because that's what we've always done. And like I've said a million times, the Crusades, the Black Death, all these things started to change all that. All right, any comments about the contrasts between the Renaissance and the medieval period? Think about it, if you were living in medieval times, wouldn't you enjoy a fresh perspective?
You know, part of it, I think, too, Bill, is that the medieval section, the Middle Ages were right after the fall of the Roman Empire and all that authority and all that, you know, security.
Mhm.
All of a sudden, you had to have these little things to make up for that loss. Now, all of a sudden, as you pointed out, the society's changed. It's becoming more secure. Money, reading.
Yeah.
Power, education.
And especially outside the church,
Outside of
because the church provided the stability after the fall of the Roman Empire. And now that they're finding, that's a very good point, they're finding stability, they're finding satisfaction in other areas. Now that not only allows them to not be so dependent on the church, but also to begin to question the church, especially as they see all these abuses, where they see, like I said, priests up through the Pope being immoral and using money from the church for their own temporal means. Yeah. Yeah, good perspective. Any other comments? All right, the term that's generally applied to this new perspective is humanism. Now, we have to be careful in a way of using that term or understanding that term, because today when we hear the word humanism, most Christians have a negative idea about that. And maybe you've heard the adjective applied with that, calling it secular humanism. Secular humanism, although you might say it's a cousin of this humanism, is not the same. Look at what this slide tells us. During the Middle Ages, scholars have been guided by the teachings of the church, and people had concerned themselves with actions leading to heavenly rewards. So there was a totally spiritual perspective here. During the Renaissance, Western Europeans rediscovered the classics of ancient Greece and Rome and became more focused on humans, their intellect, and life here on earth. And so we call that more secular. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's godless. If you remember back when we looked at the different kinds of priests there were in the church, there were some priests that were called secular priests. Do you remember what that meant? That just meant those are the priests that function in society, in the world. They're the priests that baptize and marry and bury and all those things, as opposed to the priests that were maybe in a monastery or someplace. So secular doesn't necessarily mean godless. During both the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, religion was still important. The main difference being how God was viewed. Now, what that means is this. Prior to the Renaissance, the focus was on God through the church, almost to the exclusion of man. So all I'm concerned about is getting to heaven, getting out of this world and getting to heaven. The Renaissance brought a new perspective in that the focus became more on man and humanity and the abilities that man has and the intellect of man and on all those things, which for some did lead to a move away from God, but to many others, it was simply an enhancement of their thinking about God. So let me just say for those of us that are here, as we look around at creation I'm sure you've done this, you walk out and look in your yard or I look out my back window and see the birds, I see trees and flowers and it creates in me a sense of worship because I recognize what God has created. Now, someone who's not a Christian may look at the same scene and either want to worship what they see in creation, or may want to simply dismiss it and say, wow, isn't it great how things just happen by chance for that to come about? So we're looking at the same thing, but coming up with a different perspective. And humanism can be that same way. Humanism, and we'll even talk about art, and we look at art. And there are going to be some artists that will look at and think, well, what they have painted is really man-centered and not God-centered, and we may be right. But there are also some painters who are painting, and we can say, wow, look at the abilities that that person has, that God has given them, and how they're using those abilities to bring glory to God. Those are both kinds of humanism. You follow what I'm saying? All right, any comments about what I've said there? Sorry, I rambled for a while. You need to write down your thoughts so when I take a break, you can get it in.
By 3 a.m, I'll say, oh.
All right, so in the Renaissance, there was this focus on man. The Renaissance began with the rediscovery of the pagan Greco-Roman civilization, which had been generally neglected by the religious-minded Christian medieval world because of its paganism. And that's where some of the problem lies as we will begin looking at paintings. We're going to see a lot of focus on paganism. Now, are they glorifying paganism, or are they just using that as subject matter to use the abilities God's given them? Well, those are some of the discussions that we can have. So the Renaissance began with paganism, and they emphasized human individuality, ability, and dignity, which are all part of a Christian perspective. Enthusiasm for antiquity and the study of the classics, such as Plato and Socrates, led to a sense that life isn't just a bleak process of waiting for reward in the afterlife, but rather that life itself can be rewarding. And isn't that true for us? Isn't that true that life itself can be rewarding? I think sometimes evangelical Christians, and maybe even more looking at the past fundamentalist Christians, have communicated that life itself is not rewarding, that you're just, we just wait around for the sweet by and by. Doesn't matter what's going on around us. Doesn't matter that things are deteriorating. To many Christians, that's a good sign. That means Jesus is coming sooner, rather than us being concerned about the world around us, enjoying the world around us. Rather, at least the way I grew up, so you're afraid to enjoy things because if you enjoyed it, it must be wrong. It must be sin. But there was an interest in all things human, including art, knowledge, and tradition. Libraries opened to the public. Dutch artist Pieter Bruegel, and Elizabeth, if you know that I'm mispronouncing any of these, don't be afraid to jump in. He began painting the lives of everyday people, breaking a 1,000-year tradition of confining art to religious topics and bland portraits of important people. It also became acceptable to paint the Roman and Greek gods as a form of knowledge that was no longer viewed as having religious connotations. So in other words, painting the gods wasn't a promotion of paganism. It was simply using them as a subject. But there came to be a dependence, or at least a thinking of the ancient philosophers as being important, and maybe as important as anyone else that they may know in their own time. The Renaissance scholar Leonardo de' Medici stated, "Without Plato, it would be hard to be a good Christian or a good citizen." Now, see, I think there's where they're going further than they ought to. But remember, the Christianity to which they had been exposed was not biblical Christianity. And so they found things in Plato that were refreshing. They found things in Plato that seemed to encourage them in living their lives and not just waiting to be taken out of this world. Any comments or questions? Here are some of the key events in Renaissance history. There are lots more we could probably point to, but we're going to be looking at the Medici family, and this is the beginning of that. The man who inherits a bank in 1429 in Florence. The Gutenberg Bible. I mean, look when that takes place, 1454. Just, well, a little less than 40 years before Columbus reaches the Bahamas and finds that there's this whole new continent out there that they didn't know about. Michelangelo finishes David. Machiavelli publishes The Prince. The Peace of Augsburg. And what's not in there, because it's not Renaissance, but it's in a sense a product of the Renaissance too, is the Reformation in 1517. So just what, 50, 60 years after the Gutenberg Bible is published, the Reformation comes on the scene, without which the printing press wouldn't have happened. Without the Renaissance, it wouldn't have happened. There's so many things that are tied together. The first modern atlas published in 1570. These things are happening quickly and are related to one another. All right, let's look at the course of the Renaissance.
What year was the Reformation?
Well, Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses in 1517. That's considered usually the beginning of the Reformation. But 1520s is where it really gets going. The Renaissance arose in the Italian cities. The center of Greco-Roman culture, Italy contained sculpture, buildings, roads, and manuscripts that excited curiosity about classical civilization. Located on the Mediterranean, Italy had absorbed stimulating new ideas from the advanced Byzantine, that's the eastern part of the empire, and Muslim worlds. Some of the renewed interest in Greek and Roman antiquity may have developed as the result of the fall of Constantinople to the Muslims in 1453, which caused the migration of Greek scholars to migrate to Italy and other Western European countries, bringing their Greek works with them. Ancient works virtually unknown during the Middle Ages became important foci of study and critique. Benefiting from the revival of trade following the Crusades and the Black Death, Italy had wealthy, influential people who became patrons or supporters of literature, art, and science. The leading Renaissance patrons were certain popes in Rome, wealthy merchants in Venice, the Sforza family in Milan, and the most well-known, the Medici family in Florence. So Italy becomes the starting point of the Renaissance partially because of her location, partly because of her history, in that that's where Roman civilization was located, partly by the influx due to her location from points east of two cultures, the Byzantine and the Muslim, who had preserved many of the Greek works. But then it took people with money to finance the works of art that would come about. And many of these, especially those coming from the Medici family, were in the city of Florence. So the Renaissance started in Florence and spread throughout Europe. There was competition between the different Italian city-states, which, competition is good. And it led to advances in literature, architecture, art, music, science, and education. Where there's no competition, things don't flourish. They die. So don't allow the government and the media to convince you that competition is bad. Competition is good. And in Florence, the major family that influenced that was the Medici family, who were bankers. And I'll tell you a little more about that in a minute. And because of their support, Florence became the center of the Renaissance movement. The one who was most responsible for the promotion of the arts was Lorenzo de' Medici, called Il Magnifico, the Magnificent. I've been amazed as I have been studying the Renaissance period and before and after, how many things happened in 1492. Remember, that's the year that the Moors were driven out of Spain. It's the year Columbus sailed. Now we see it's the year that Lorenzo de' Medici died. So he had already put into place all the influences that he would have in the Renaissance. Lorenzo was third in a line of influential bankers in the city of Florence. If I remember correctly, I think his family originally came from Spain, but his grandfather had become a banker in Florence, and that was an important position. And it was passed on from father to son, and then to Lorenzo, the grandson. And although there was no official position in the city government for the Medici family, because of their great influence as bankers, they were recognized as the supreme power in the state and as the equals of kings and princes. So we might talk about the ruler that is ruler by law, but then the ruler that's the ruler by reality. And the Medici were ruler by reality. Historian Dorothy Mills described him thusly: Lorenzo was generous. He was unscrupulous. He had charm and fascination. He could be hard and cruel. So he has various degrees and sides to him. This is a coin with his visage as well there. Most of all, beyond all that, Lorenzo had money, and he lavished it upon numerous artisans to the enjoyment of many to this very day. Why was money so important? Well, besides the obvious, you could get fine clothing, good food, expensive things, but most importantly, it could buy you respect. You could glorify God with your money, because that's the way to get a rich rascal like yourself into heaven, is spend your money on glorifying God. Or you could glorify your city. That's the way to get ahead in politics and power. or you could glorify yourself and your family, which is the way to real immortality, at least immortality on earth. You know, you might have a statue raised in your honor. So why did these patrons give so much? Well, in Renaissance Italy, making money and getting rich was considered sinful, unless you're the Pope or a bishop. The Catholic Church even banned banks from charging interest on loans. That, by the way, is how the Jews got involved in banking, because not being Christians, they could charge interest. That didn't stop anyone from trying to get rich. Those who got rich usually felt an obligation to give something back to society. A work of art became a popular item for rich bankers and merchants to commission on behalf of their family, their city, or their god. All right, any questions or comments to this point about the beginning of the Renaissance and the perspective of the wealthy people who are the patrons?
This is the question, how did bankers make money?
Well, they had to charge interest. They did it anyway. The church said you're not allowed to, but they did anyway. Yeah.
I heard that before, they weren't allowed to charge interest.
Yeah.
Jews were.
I should have said that. In the 15th century, Renaissance ideas began to spread from Italy to France, the German states, Holland, and England. I know that this map may be difficult to see, but I think you can make out that this is the boot of Italy. This is the center of the Renaissance, and it is moving north into France, Germany, Holland, England, and over to Spain. The ideas are disseminating. And at least in part, if not the whole, of how they disseminated was through the trade routes. And you can see the trade routes coming from Italy. Because remember, we talked some time ago about how it's the Italian merchants that brought so many of the materials into Europe, that got people interested in the East, in China and India, which then precipitated the desire to find a way to get there, to be able to get those products without going through the Italians. And so there are all these trade routes that were established, some by sea and some by land. And as merchants are moving their goods from the merchants of Italy into the rest of Europe, they're also bringing ideas. They're also bringing things that they've heard, and manuscripts and books. So all these things are going throughout the rest of Europe. This cultural diffusion resulted from religious contacts, even between different monasteries, for example, or people traveling from one location to another on religious journeys. Military, there are military engagements going on, and as soldiers go from place to place, they carry with them information. And then commercial contacts through trade. And then as it became known that Italy was a focus of learning, many people traveled there from these other countries in order to absorb Italian art and learning, and then returned eventually to their own countries and brought those ideas with them. I'm debating whether to proceed to the next part, because I don't want to get partway through it. So I think that it might be a good place for us to stop tonight. And that will give us next week to go through the next section in your outline, which is thought and literature. And it may be possible for us to go through all of the important writers of the Renaissance. So rather than start and then picking up next week, I think we'll stop right there. All right, any comments or questions about what we've talked about tonight?
I think the Renaissance is like the point of the
Demarcation.
demarcation. Yeah, I knew that was not. That prior to this, everything was the church, and everything was God.
Mm-hmm.
From 1592 to 1429, it shifts. And it's a major shift. The highway is the highway lies. And I think it's exciting. And it's sort of boring because people are trying to internalize what Christ is all about.
Mhm.
And now say, okay, Christ is over here. This is the world he created. And we're off to contain it and reproduce it and talk about it.
And like I mentioned before, without the Renaissance, there's really no Reformation either. It took this change in perspective in a lot of ways to bring about what's going to happen with the Reformation. Because even though in the Middle Ages, supposedly the focus was on God, it really wasn't a positive focus at all. It was largely negative because God was a severe judge. And there's not a positive outlook at all. So the Renaissance at least provided the questions to ask concerning what the church was teaching, to bring people to a realization that what the church had been teaching was not an accurate portrayal of God or Jesus Christ.
Reformation is where you get your first concepts of freedom.
Yes, and individuality.
What we know as freedom
Mhm.
actually comes at the end of this.
Yes. Okay. We'll stop there.
Alfred Newman.
Alfred E. Newman.
This is the message of sleep.
Really?
And
Does it hurt? Or just, what's your time ago?
yeah, that must be weird.